So it was a bright, cold winter morning in Boston, and a young man was crossing the Boston Common on his way to the Arlington Street station, the T station. Maybe some of you know that subway stop just off the Common. The man had decided that that morning he'd buy a token. This was back when you still used tokens to ride the subway in Boston. He'd buy a token and enter the station and end his life on the third rail. The demons in the young man's head had convinced him that life was no longer worth living. He was just about to head down the steps from the sidewalk to the station platform when he heard a voice call to him, "Welcome." Caught up in his own thoughts of suicide, the man briefly wondered whether this welcome was the angel of death beckoning him. Again, he heard, "Welcome." This time he was pretty sure it wasn't an angel, at least not an angel of death. You see, it was a Sunday morning, and the ushers of the Arlington Street Church, the historic Unitarian church right in front of that subway stop, the ushers were out on the front step with a handshake and a smile welcoming people to church, and one of those ushers mistook this unhappy man for a visitor to the church, and he looked at the man and he smiled and he said, "Welcome." And the confusion gave the troubled man pause. And he decided he'd go in and just say one final prayer in church before taking his life. So he walked in, and as the service began, he stayed. And something that was said or that happened in church that morning caused the man to reconsider his decision to take his own life. Something gave him whatever it was he needed to keep on going. And I'm told that after that morning, the man became a devoted member of the Arlington Street Church. Now, who knows what it was that changed the man's mind that morning? It might have been a beautiful piece of music sung by the choir, or consoling words spoken by the pastor. If I knew what those words were, I would be sure to say them every Sunday. But one thing seems certain. If that man hadn't been met face to face by another human being, if he hadn't been greeted with a smile and a welcome, he probably would have ended his life that morning. I've been thinking about this story a lot as we approach our return to in-person worship in Stephen's Chapel. It feels like a good time to remind ourselves of the power of religious community and authentic human, in the flesh, human presence. As we begin welcoming one another and newcomers back to our chapel, it's not a bad idea to remind ourselves that sometimes there's a lot riding on how we welcome people on Sunday morning. When folks walk through the doors of the church, we have no idea what's going on in their lives. We don't know what sorrow or joy or pain they bring. What we can do is offer a warm greeting, a smile, a handshake, maybe a hug. We can offer up to their humanity the simple but profound gift of our own. And we owe that to one another, don't we? Every single one of us deserves to have our worth and dignity acknowledged and respected. That's central to our faith as Unitarian Universalists. As UUs, we often like to cite the first principle of our faith. We believe in the inherent worth and dignity of every person. But you know what? It's really not sufficient to frame human dignity as simply a belief. What it really is, I think, is a promise, a covenant. What we really need to be saying is, I promise, I covenant to honor and respect and protect your worth and dignity. Unless we can say that, it doesn't really mean much for us to say we believe in another's worth and dignity. We have to be able to say, I see you as a being with inherent worth, and I will meet you face to face on the common ground of our shared humanity. That's the covenant we make with one another as human beings. The great Jewish mystic and theologian Martin Buber called this covenant I and thou. Maybe you've heard of Buber's I, thou before. When two human beings meet on the common ground of their shared humanity, fully acknowledging one another's worth and dignity, Buber called this an I, thou encounter. An encounter that says the humanity in me acknowledges the humanity in you. Or if you will, the divine spark in me acknowledges the spark of the divine in you. That's the meaning, after all, of the Hindu greeting, namaste, right? Namaste, the divine in me acknowledges the divine in you. Buber believed that such encounters were sacred. He wrote, when two people relate to each other authentically and humanly, God is the electricity that surges between them. I kind of like that. He also believed that our salvation lies in the power and potential of human relationships. And contemporary social science would seem to back him up on this. The sociologist Susan Pinker studies the impact on our lives of deeply grounded human relationships. She discovered that the single best determinant of health and longevity is not whether you smoke or drink or have a history of heart disease, though those are important. The single best determinant of health and longevity is the quality of your human relationships. She writes, people with close relationships and face-to-face intimacy are better off emotionally and physically, and they live longer. Yet, she says, a quarter of the population reports that they have no one to talk to. This is a matter of life or death, she concludes. What that man learned on the front steps of the Arlington Street Church, what Martin Buber wrote about in I, Thou, is true. A human face, an honest-to-goodness human relationship can literally save your life. It can certainly enrich your life. After 2 years of pandemic restrictions, when many of us have been deprived of some of the benefits of face-to-face human encounter, I think now is a good time for us to kind of take the temperature of our own closest relationships. Which relationships enrich or even save my life, right? Which relationships have atrophied over the pandemic and might need to be revived now? I think we all aspire to the kind of authentic relationship that Buber describes as I, thou. It's how we want to be treated. It's how we want to treat others. But let's face it, all too often we fall short of this deeply humane encounter. There are lots of reasons why. For one thing, we're all caught up in a capitalist culture that instrumentalizes human beings, that reduces our worth to our productive value in the marketplace. The social scientist Brené Brown once spent a day paying attention to how folks treated the service workers they encountered in their lives. She went for a manicure and noticed that many of the other women at the nail bar spent the entire time on their cell phones, barely acknowledging the women who were caring for their bodies. At the grocery checkout, people would have entire interactions with the checkout clerk while talking to someone else on their phone, acknowledging the clerk with just nods and grunts and hand gestures. A teller at a drive-through McDonald's teared up when she told Brown how humiliating it was to be treated like an object all day rather than a person. Sometimes our own sense of self-worth is so damaged, it's hard to acknowledge the dignity of others. Other times our narcissism or selfishness leads us to treat others as mere means to our own ends. But a lot of times I think we're just too busy or preoccupied or rushed to acknowledge another's humanity. And we just brush them off. This was Martin Buber's story, actually. One day, a troubled student came to Buber's study door and asked to see him, but Buber was immersed in prayer and he said, "I'm busy now, please come back later." Well, the student never came back. And Buber later learned that he took his own life. Haunted by this missed connection, Buber devoted himself to this I-thou ethic. So how do we do it? How do we strengthen the quality of our human encounters and relationships? How do we treat our fellow human beings with the respect they deserve? It may be that the answer to this question is hidden in that very word, respect. Respect, of course, comes from the Latin root meaning to see. Spectacle, spectator, perspective. Respect then means to see again. Or as one teacher of mine likes to say, respect means to take another look. Oftentimes, our first look at another human being is nothing more than a cursory glance, isn't it? We barely notice the person we pass on the sidewalk. We skim the stories of other lives in the newspaper. We exchange a please and thank you or a have a nice day with barely a thought. We don't always see people in their full humanity the first time around. Sometimes we need the presence of mind and the time to take another look at someone before we can really acknowledge their full humanity and extend to them the respect they deserve. Respect. To take another look at the people we meet. This week we can experiment with this. As we go about our day and week, we might be especially mindful of our interactions with folks. To remind ourselves to take another look at the people we greet, strangers, friends. You know, sometimes the people we're closest to, the people we love, seem so familiar to us that we don't think it's even necessary for us to take another look. We think we already know who's there. But our loved ones especially deserve to be and feel seen by us in the present moment. So as you head out into the world this week, notice which encounters feel merely transactional or instrumental. and which feel more like the meeting of two people who share a common humanity, who share a common worth and dignity. Notice how those different encounters make you feel. Notice the conditions, internal or external to you, that contribute to one kind of relationship or another. And practice respect. Take another look at the people you encounter. You know, when I first heard that story about the man whose plans to take his life were interrupted on the front steps of the Arlington Street Church, I chalked up that story at first to a case of mistaken identity. The usher mistook the troubled man for a congregant or visitor. But now that I think about it, maybe it wasn't that after all. Maybe the usher simply took another look at a stranger passing by at the sidewalk. And in that second look, that respect, he saw another human being who might have been suffering. And that look made all the difference. I wonder if we can be that church where everyone who walks through our doors gets another look and enjoys the respect they deserve. You know, if all goes according to plan, we will return to in-person worship in the chapel next month. Hallelujah. And knock on wood. I invite us to think of the reopening of our chapel as a great opportunity to take another look at one another, to see one another again, perhaps for the first time, certainly for the first time in a long time, and to be intentional about re-entering our community with respect and love. I think it's also an opportunity to take another look at who we are as a community. When we return to the chapel, we're not going to be the same community we were 2 years ago when we last worshiped together in person. We've lost some beloved members of our community over these years. Others have joined us and enriched our community. We've all changed, and so has the island. As we return to in-person worship, we have a unique opportunity to rediscover who we are and how we've changed as a spiritual community. You know, and finally, in light of that story about the troubled man at the Arlington Street Church, I want to especially encourage us to develop an intentional habit as we return to the chapel of taking another look at the strangers and newcomers who pass through our doors. Remember what I said earlier? We don't know what our neighbor is going through. We don't know what's pain or sorrow or joy they bring as they pass through our doors on Sunday morning. But we can offer them the gift of our humanity, the gift of another human face, a warm word of welcome. You know, in church, I think a greeting is more than just good manners. It's more than just a social nicety. When we really meet and greet one another with respect at church, it can be a kind of sacrament. The divine in me greets the divine in you. The deep humanity in me greets the deep humanity in you. Thomas More, the author of the best-selling book, Care of the Soul, once told a group of us Unitarian ministers, he said, the one thing the soul needs most more than anything else is a friend. A friend. So be a kind and gentle friend to a soul today, starting with your own. Amen.